Hello and welcome again. This is our third lecture and we are going to discuss social perception and social cognition. Social perception and social cognition deals with one of the most fundamental and sophisticated skills of human beings, our ability to perceive, represent and make sense of what goes on around us in the social world, and in particular to make sense of the social behavior of others and ourselves. So social perception and cognition is essentially the study of how we interpret, analyze and remember information about our social world. This includes a wide variety of tasks. How do we form impressions of others? How do we predict the behavior of other people? What role do schemas play in social cognition? What types of mental shortcuts we use? How do we explain the causes of behavior? What kind of biases and errors influence our thinking? And how do our feelings, emotions, and moods influence our thoughts? Social perception and cognition is above all highly constructive. In other words, very often what we see is not necessarily what's out there, but the way we interpret it. Because social perception is highly constructive, some biases are unavoidable. Susan Fiske, a well-known social psychologist, described social perception as follows. We search the social horizon unaware that we are using mental binoculars and that things are much further away than they appear. All our experience is actually mediated or filtered through a psychological lens, our perceiving apparatus. Although we experience the world as if we take in a literal unaltered copy, in fact each person passes reality through a different lens. In other words, in a sense, each and every one of us has a slightly different mental representation of the social world. The reason for that is that human cognition is not really designed to perceive reality the way it is. Rather, human cognition has been shaped by evolutionary pressures to employ shortcuts and simplifications. Much of the social information that we rely on is second-hand. It's not based on direct experience. It's based on information we get from others ready-made that we accept as true. In addition, our cognitive capacity is also seriously constrained, limited. You remember we discussed Daniel Kahneman's suggestion that humans are endowed with two different kinds of information processing styles, type 1 and type 2 processing. Type 1 employs shortcuts, simplifications, and relies on past experience. Type 2 is the kind of analytic, systematic thinking when we actually take effort to examine the available information carefully. The human cognitive apparatus is subject to a number of biases, and we're going to come across this as we continue with this topic. We already mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's a well-established tendency for people to overestimate their expertise and their knowledge. And paradoxically, the less expert you are in a particular field, the less you know about a particular judgment, the more confident people tend to be that they know what they are talking about. It's a paradoxical effect. Subjective judgments are also influenced by confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and pay special attention to information that confirms what you want to believe. We have already seen in the second lecture that human social thinking is deeply influenced by group influences, the way particular reference group to which we belong influence our thinking and representation of reality. And shared ideologies, symbolic value systems and belief systems also have a very important distorting effect on the way we form social judgments. Let's look at one example, a very important topical issue. What do people know or think they know and believe about global warming? If you look at this chart, you will see that since 1999 till 2009, in a 10-year period, there have been huge fluctuations on people's attitudes and beliefs about global warming. Some people believe that the claims are hugely exaggerated, others believe them to be correct, and some people were arguing that the claims about catastrophic global warming are actually underestimated. It's a typical case of a social judgment. Now, how do such judgments get processed? Opinions about global warming differ because people are basically formulating a social judgment which is influenced in no small measure by the groups they belong to, their general beliefs and ideologies, and the kind of information they have access to. The scientific hypothesis of global warming is a complicated prediction based on multiple interlocking causal statements, each of which needs to be examined and evaluated separately. There are claims about warming occurring, which is very well established. There are other claims that it is largely due to carbon dioxide, but there are debates as to what other gases might contribute to global warming. The argument that it is due to human causes also received some discussion, since only about 5% of global carbon dioxide emissions are human caused. Most of it comes from natural sources, some of which are poorly understood. There's also a question about whether it is actually preventable by reducing that 5% of carbon dioxide emissions that are due to human activity, and how much of a difference that might actually make. And there are disagreements about the outcomes, to what extent it would be a disaster, a catastrophe, or potentially manageable. And there is disagreements among experts. Climate scientists tend to take one view, geoscientists often take another view. So the average voter has to make a decision using essentially exactly the same processes that we use to make decisions about other social issues. Making such a decision involves trust. It involves taking into account the groups we belong to and how other people in those groups generally think about the matter. In other words, we have all the hallmarks of a complex social decision based on our social perceptions. Our beliefs about global warming, like all other social beliefs, are to some extent dependent on the reference group to which we belong. There are disagreements about the nature of the risk, and it's kind of surprising that in a matter that should be exclusively the subject of scientific belief, political ideology plays a great role. It's well established that people on the political left tend to be far more concerned about global warming than people on the right. On the face of it, that shows that climate change beliefs are essentially social beliefs. They're influenced by the general ideology and belief systems of the individual. It's also interesting that there is a lot of political rhetoric that influences climate change ideas. Some people claim that it's a question of belief, which is sort of reminiscent of almost religious certainty. Social psychologists like Lee Jassim argue that no scientific hypothesis ever is certain, and because it cannot be certain, it is inappropriate to label those who have doubts as deniers. Denial only occurs when you have absolute certainty that you happen to disagree with. So even climate change belief is a case of social cognition, and our doubts, uncertainties are basically resolved socially. The kind of things that influence our beliefs have to do with fear, doubt, skepticism, the tendency to believe catastrophic scenarios, and mainly the kind of group beliefs and ideologies that we subscribe to. So social perception and cognition are not actually about perceiving reality as it is, but about constructing or reconstructing a representation. This is very obvious when we compare the characteristics of physical perception and social perception. Physical perception is about manifest features of the world, color, size, weight, and so on. When you look at a room or a chair, the characteristics of the object, the physical characteristics, are static, are enduring, and if necessary can be re-examined to achieve certainty. Social characteristics are not like that. Social characteristics are not immediately visible. They're not on the surface. When you judge a person to be friendly, friendliness is not a feature that you can simply look at and identify. Friendliness has to be inferred. This is what we mean when we say that social perception is constructive. A judgment of friendliness needs to be constructed and inferred from observed behaviors. Because of the inferential nature of social judgments, different people will often come up with different judgments. Another problem with social perception is that our judgments are not testable. You cannot actually ascertain for sure whether a person is friendly or not. It's a very difficult trait to establish with certainty. Social perception is also open to self-serving biases. If somebody is your enemy, your perception of their friendliness will be distorted by your relationship. We're not objective when judging personal qualities, but we engage in self-serving explanations. We want to see the world in ways that is most comfortable and least challenging for us. So social perception is highly constructive, and what we already know and expect about other people will influence what we see. As a consequence of that, social perception is not accurate. In everyday life, we usually function with the belief that our judgments of people are more or less accurate and our social judgments are more or less accurate. Whatever is your view on climate change, you tend to be quite sure that you got the right idea. Whatever is your perception of a politician like Donald Trump, you are quite sure that you got an accurate perception. In fact, it turns out that accuracy in social perception is very problematic. It's also difficult to study. In order to study accuracy, you need to have three different factors. You have to have a target to judge. That's fairly easy. Let's say Donald Trump. You need to have a measure on which you assess judgments of that target, and that can be paper and pencil measures, behavioral measures, and a whole lot of other kinds of assessments. And most importantly, you need to have a criterion, a yardstick, against which you can evaluate whether the judgment is correct or not. And this is where the problems really arise. The yardstick is very difficult to establish in such a way that it is objective and reliable. Let's say your judgment of Donald Trump is that he's a narcissist. Now, how do we establish if this judgment is accurate or correct? Essentially, there is no absolutely reliable way to do it. We could give him a test of narcissism, we can observe his behavior, we can ask his friends and his family, but none of these criterions are absolutely objective. They are all, to some extent, biased and uncertain. Social psychology studying person perception accuracy first looked at that issue almost 100 years ago. For example, Landis in 1924 was interested to find out if people can perceive emotions in another person accurately. Landis carried out an experiment that you certainly could not replicate today for ethical reasons. He asked a set of target persons to engage in highly emotional behaviors. for example, to fish around in a bucket of water to catch some frogs, or to saw off the head of a live rat. Now, these are deeply emotionally involving and arousing activities. He took a photo of the targets while they engaged in these emotional activities. He then showed the photo to a number of judges and asked them to decide on the basis of the facial expression of the targets what was happening and what they were feeling. Landis found that people are very bad at this task. They are not able to correctly identify the kind of emotions that the targets were experiencing. And so he concluded that person perception accuracy is highly problematic and highly inaccurate. However, decades later, Ekman, a social psychologist in San Francisco, reached back to this issue and asked a question that actually was already raised by Charles Darwin in a famous book in 1872, I think, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. Charles Darwin argued that emotional expressions in humans form a continuum with emotional communication in other animals. If Darwin is right, and our emotional expressions are in some ways evolutionarily determined, then we would expect much greater accuracy because every known culture and every individual uses the same emotional expressions. Ekman tested this hypothesis by looking at emotional expressions in a number of different cultures, from Papua New Guinea all the way to the United States. And Ekman argued that emotional expressions of simple emotions, the basic emotions, are actually the same the world over, which would suggest that we should be good in recognizing simple emotions. The difference between Landis's work and Ekman's work is that Landis looked at complex emotions, involving emotional situations when people experience a whole range of feelings. Ekman looked at simple, unique emotions. So, complex emotions are not well communicated and perceived, but it seems to be that simple emotions are. In fact, Ekman went so far as to claim that emotional expression and emotional experience are directly linked in neural networks. Feeling an emotion immediately triggers the tendency to display the facial expression that corresponds to the emotion. An intriguing implication of this prediction is that it might work the other way around. If you configure your face into a particular emotional expression, let's say smiling, according to Ekman, based on Darwin's ideas, you should feel happier. The facial expression could cause an emotional state that corresponds to that facial expression. This possibility has been studied by Fritz Strack and his colleagues, a group of German social psychologists. This slide reports the results of a study by Elfenbein and Ambadi in 2002, which supports Ekman's theory and Darwin's prediction that simple emotional states are universally expressed in every culture and are recognized relatively accurately. You can see the 6 basic emotional expressions in a schematic face on the left-hand side of the slide, and you can see the levels of accuracy in people being able to recognize the emotion being communicated. And as you can see, all 6 of the basic expressions are essentially recognized very accurately, 60% or higher level of correct recognition. Now, returning to Fritz Strack and the facial feedback hypothesis, what Strack did is to ask participants to hold a pen in their mouth in 2 different ways, as you can see on the pictures, either in their teeth, which forces them to adopt a kind of smiling facial expression, or to hold it in their lips, which results in a kind of pouting, more negative facial expression. While participants held the pen in either a smiling or a pouting position, they were asked to engage in a number of social judgments. And Strack, Martin, and Stepper found that holding the pen in a smiling way results in more positive judgments on a number of items, and holding the pen in the pouting way results in more negative judgments. Now, this data suggests that there is indeed a bidirectional neural link between facial nerves and emotional experience, such that emotional experience triggers facial expression, and vice versa, facial expression impacts on emotional experience. The bottom picture actually illustrates that in a Chinese corporation, employees, they seem to be nurses, are trained to adopt a smiling facial expression using exactly the technique that Strack invented, holding a pen in their mouth. I should also mention that Strack's study has not been reliably replicated. Some people found it difficult to get the same effect, but that does not annihilate the facial feedback hypothesis, because there are other studies which also support this idea. You might even go further. It may be that the bodily posture that a person adopts in a particular case can also influence their social judgments. Stepper and Strack in 1993 published a paper where they manipulated participants to sit in either a slumped position by adopting the height of the table, or in a straight adopted position by changing the height of the table. And while they were in this bodily position, they were asked to perform a number of social judgments. They found that when people adopt a straight posture, they show improved pride in their social judgments in a completed task. When they are in a slumped posture, they seem to experience more negative mood and make more negative. So far, we looked at the accuracy of person perception when it comes to perceiving emotions in other people. But of course, we're not only looking for emotional information, we tend to look for more complex information about personality and individual characteristics. Research on the accuracy of perceiving individual features shows a rather depressing result. It turns out that people are not very good in perceiving and interpreting personal characteristics. There's even some interesting studies that show that when you give people special training, for example, if you look at emotional or person perception accuracy in psychologists or actors who are professionals in communication, their performance is often worse than performance by untrained people. So there's a real puzzle here. Why is it that person perception accuracy is so difficult? And especially, why is it that people who should know about personal communication are not particularly good at it? This question was answered by Kronbach, a social cognitive psychologist, methodologist, who basically argued that person perception accuracy is not a single skill. We use a single word to describe it, but really when you analyze it, there is a multiple factorial capability involved. For example, Kronbach argued that one kind of accuracy is to correctly stereotype the type of person you are dealing with. You could call this stereotype accuracy. The other accuracy is the opposite of this, called differential accuracy, when you are good in perceiving how a unique individual actually differs from the stereotype. The reason why communication professionals like psychologists and actors are not so good in person perception is that they over-differentiate. They rely too much on differential accuracy, and as a result, they pay too much attention to individual variations and not sufficient attention to stereotype accuracy. And as we have seen, the reason for inaccuracy is also because person perception is influenced by expectations, cognitive limitations. It turns out even by the mood you happen to be at the time when you perform a person perception judgment. Even experts are not particularly good in, for example, detecting deception. This is a study from 1991 by Ekman and Sullivan, who tested the accuracy of different groups of people in catching a liar, perceiving deception in a person. Now, the chance of getting it right is 50-50. And as you can see, the only group of people who were significantly better than average were US Secret Service agents who could correctly catch a liar 64% of the time. But even this is not a particularly impressive performance. I mentioned before that mood states, surprisingly, can also bias our person perception judgments. I was involved in a series of experiments looking at these effects. Here are the results of just one study, which was carried out at Stanford University in 1984. In that study, we induced participants into a positive or a negative mood by hypnotic mood induction. That happens when you hypnotize people to experience a positive or a negative mood state and then give them a post-hypnotic suggestion that they will be able to open their eyes and function normally all the time experiencing the mood that we induced. Then we asked them to watch videos of an interaction they participated in the previous day. And a day later, after the videos were recorded, they were asked to come back into the lab and watch the videotape and form judgments about their own behavior and the behavior of their partners. And what the results showed, as you can see in the graph, is that when it comes to self-ratings, people in a positive mood, a good mood, see far more positive than negative behaviors in themselves compared to people who are induced into a bad mood, who see more negative behaviors and more positive behaviors. Judgments of the partners are also distorted by the hypnotically induced mood. The positive mood participants see more positive behaviors and fewer negative behaviors in the other person. In a negative mood, though, they are not as critical of the other person. The negative behaviors are less numerous. That is actually quite consistent what people in clinical psychology find with depressed people. Depressed cognition shows a very similar pattern. When people are depressed, they selectively distort their judgments of themselves, but they do not see as much negativity in other people. So in a way, this experiment induced temporary negative mood and produced a kind of person perception bias or judgment that is very similar to what you find in clinical states like depression. The self-other differences are particularly interesting because they match the differences we find in depressed cognition. Now, as I mentioned before, the reason for the low accuracy in person perception judgment is partly that the human cognitive information processing ability is limited, and so people tend to often use mental shortcuts or heuristics to form a judgment rather than paying careful attention to the actual qualities of the person they are observed. There is good reason for that. Using heuristics serves cognitive economy. If you do not have to process every single piece of information online, you can save a lot of mental processing capacity. And there is also evidence that these mental shortcuts have an evolutionary origin. It made good sense in our evolutionary past to rely on past knowledge as much as possible rather than have to develop new judgments every time you come across an already familiar situation. There is a number of these mental shortcuts and heuristics that social psychologists have identified. For example, there is the representativeness heuristic, when we judge a person in terms of what kind of type of person they resemble, and we rely on that resemblance information to form a judgment. If you look at the short video, The Waiter's Mistake, it is an illustration of just this kind of representativeness heuristic. In the video, a waiter brings two different meals to a kind of fat, bulky person and a thin person, and spontaneously assume that the bigger meal must have been ordered by the larger person. That's relying on representativeness incorrectly, as it turns out in the video. Another interesting heuristic is the anchoring effect. That refers to the fact that our judgments tend to be subconsciously influenced by where we start our thinking. In the anchoring effect, if you ask people questions about, say, factual information, how long is the Mississippi River? Now, most of us have no idea, and you come up with a completely random answer. However, if you phrase the question differently and you ask, is the Mississippi River longer than 60 miles? Or in the alternative condition, you say, is the Mississippi River longer than 5,000 miles? You get markedly different answers. Giving the number 60 or 5,000 gives an anchor for starting to guess. When it's a 60-mile anchor, people estimate the length to be much shorter than when the question refers to 5,000 miles. So anchoring refers to the fact that when we are uncertain, when we have no real information about the correct judgment, we basically start at a random point, and that anchor influences the outcome. Another important heuristic bias is called the availability heuristic. That is the tendency of biasing your judgments in terms of what comes to mind most easily, what is more accessible. There are many, many everyday examples of the heuristic bias. The little video, Sharks versus Horses, makes the point that we all think sharks are terribly dangerous, but in fact horses kill more people every year than sharks do. The reason why sharks are perceived to be dangerous is because we read about it a lot. It's a very available information. When a shark kills a man, it's all over the world in the news. So the dangerousness of sharks is highly available. The dangerousness of horses, on the other hand, isn't. There are many examples of the availability heuristic distorting our perceptions of reality. For example, most people are much more concerned about terrorism than traffic accidents. And yet, traffic accidents kill many, many more people than terrorists ever do. Again, it's an example of the availability heuristic. What it means is that whenever social information begets second-hand, is highly interesting, highly colorful, very personal, and therefore memorable, that information will be highly available and will have a hugely distorted influence on our judgments. This is why most people are much more likely to pay attention to personal stories about illness and cure than statistics. And yet, personal stories are far less reliable and often completely incorrect. Statistics give you the correct answer, but it's not as colorful, not as memorable, and therefore is much less likely to influence your judgments. There are also priming effects. This refers to the fact that whatever you have been recently exposed to is likely to have a subconscious influence on your behavior. Several experiments showed that if you expose people to, for example, a poster about old age in a room, and you then measure how fast they walk to the elevator after the test is over, it turns out that the speed of walking is influenced by priming the concept of age in those subjects. Counterfactuals is another biasing influence on the way we see the world. Tomasz Gilovich at Cornell University has done interesting studies showing that social judgments are distorted not by what you see, but by your perception of what might have been. Gilovich's work looked at how happy people are in sports competitions after they win the first, the second, or the third place. What he's done, he videotaped winners at the Olympics and at local sports competition, and then he analyzed their facial expressions to see how happy they were. And he found a fascinating effect. The people who come first are the happiest. The people who come third are the second happiest. And people who come second are the least happy. Now, what might cause this? Gilovich argues that the reason for this surprising effect is that the first and second and the third people think differently about what might have been. A person who comes second has only just missed being first, and so they're not so happy because they were very close to winning, but they didn't. A person who comes third thinks about, I almost didn't make it. So they are happier than people who come second. The counterfactual is the thought, the memory, the knowledge, not of what is, but what might have been. Think about an everyday example. Let's say you're trying to catch the bus, and as you approach, the bus just pulls out before you reach it. Or the bus left 5 minutes ago. You're much more upset when you only just missed the bus, because the counterfactual is, I almost got it. When the bus has gone 5 minutes, you're not really that unhappy. It's paradoxical and unreasonable, but it illustrates the fact that our judgments are often influenced not by what is, but what could have been. Embodiment is another way that social judgments are biased or distorted. That refers to the fact that the bodily position, the feeling that you happen to have at the time when performing a social judgment, somehow impacts on your social judgments. We have seen the work by Fritz Strack that when people slump, they are more negative. When they sit up straight, they're more proud. There's several other experiments making that same point. For example, when you get people to hold a hot or a cold drink in their hands, you manipulate temperature, and you ask them to perform social judgments. People with the hot drink judge people as more warm. People holding a cold drink judge people as more cold. The bodily experience of temperature infuses the social judgment that you perform at the same time. Bodily states also have a subconscious influence on the social judgments you perform. Embodiment is really about how the mind and the body are linked and connected, and bodily states have a surreptitious, subtle influence on how we think. Here is an example of the results of a study making that same point. The study by Killer and others, what was manipulated is stability, physical stability. Participants were sitting at a computer screen, at a table, and the chair and the keyboard were made to be unstable. The chair had one leg shorter than the other, so you had this feeling of instability, and the keyboard was also unstable. In the other condition, the chair and the keyboard were stable. In both conditions, participants were asked to perform judgments, including judgments about social stability, other people's relationship stability, and mean preference for stability or instability in traits in a potential mate. What Killer and others found, as you can see, that perceptions of stability are were significantly influenced by the stable or unstable physical condition. People in the stable condition see others and other people's trait as more stable than people in the unstable condition, and their preference for stability is greater when they happen to sit at an unstable desk. Now, this is again a very surprising finding, and it shows that social perception and social judgments are influenced by lots of subtle and very often unconscious factors, including our bodily states at the time. Here we have a list of a number of heuristics. There are a great many of those, and each of them refer to the kind of mental shortcuts that people employ in performing often complex social judgments. We already looked at the availability heuristic, which is listed first here. Sharks are seen as more dangerous than horses. There is a false consensus effect. People tend to believe that whatever they believe in is much more commonly shared than actually is the case. We already talked about the representativeness heuristic. And there's a bunch of other heuristics. You can read that slide at your leisure. They outline the various ways in which the human mind employs shortcuts to perform social judgments. Now, we now move on to the next topic, which is impression formation. We looked at how people make social judgments in general, but a particularly important kind of social judgments is how we put together impressions about people based on the various bits and pieces of information that we receive from them. Impression formation theories basically can be classified into two kinds: holistic or gestalt models and atomistic or mechanical models. The atomistic model is described by Norman Anderson, a social psychologist, who basically argues that impressions are formed by using a kind of predictable, transparent, cognitive algebra. So, for example, if you know about a person that they are kind, pleasant, and lazy, and each of these characteristics has a certain likability value, then your total impression of the person is an average or some algebraic summation of the values of the individual traits. The cognitive algebra model relies on the very strong assumption that each personality trait has a stable likability value. So being lazy has a negative likability value which can be quantified based on people's judgments, and being kind has a positive likability value which can also be quantified. If you establish the likability values of different traits, then you can do experiments where you describe people in terms of multiple traits, and you ask people to form a general impression of that individual. And Norman Anderson showed that with simple traits, an algebraic model can work reasonably well. The holistic or the gestalt model put forward by Solomon Asch makes a very different assumption. Asch argues that personality traits do not have stable values. They mean something different depending on what other information we have available at the time. So, for example, when you say a person is intelligent and warm, or you say a person is intelligent and cold, the meaning of intelligence slightly changes. Cold intelligence is much less desirable and likable than warm intelligence. Asch made the point that there are certain traits, which he called central traits, like warm and cold, which greatly change the value of other traits, and there are some other traits which do not have such a big effect. In other words, some traits have very variable meanings, and other traits have a big influence on how we interpret the information we have. Gestalt theories are actually very common in psychology, in physical perception as well. They refer to the universal human tendency of, even when perceiving the physical world, putting the information together in such a way that it is meaningful. The best example of this is the apparent motion phenomenon, which is what happens when you go to the movies. You experience movement. In other words, people on the screen appear to be moving, even though what you actually perceive is a series of static images projected in fast succession. The movement is not on the screen. The movement comes from your brain. Your brain puts together the quick succession of static images and interprets them as consistent with movement. In a similar way, in person perception, we also put together the traits, according to Ash, so that they produce a meaningful social impression. Now, central and peripheral traits are very important to establish Ash's theory, and we're going to look at his experiment demonstrating these effects. In this study, participants were asked to form impressions about the target person, let's say John, who is described in terms of 7 traits. So imagine that your task is to form an impression of John, who is intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious, in one condition. In the other condition, the impression formation task contains 6 of the same traits, but warm is replaced by cold. So John now is intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, and cautious. As you can see, judgments are hugely influenced by changing warm to cold. John is seen as far more generous in the warm condition, 91%, than in the cold condition, much wiser in the warm than in the cold condition, and so on all the way down on the other traits. In other words, changing just one of 7 traits produced a huge difference in total impressions. When you do that with a peripheral trait, for example, polite and blunt, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the differences are much smaller. So changing warm to cold reorients, redefines the meaning of the other 6 traits and produces a huge effect. Changing polite to blunt does not have a similar significant consequence for perceptions. Now, of course, the Ash experiment with the traits is somewhat unrealistic. We rarely form impressions of other people based on lists of words. Kelly, a social psychologist, asked the question, would these central trait effects prevail even when people have far more detailed information available about the target? What Kelly did in his experiment, he introduced a class at a university, and he told them that they're going to meet a guest lecturer. And he described this guest lecturer in terms of a list of traits. Half the class got cold as one of the traits, and the other half of the class got warm as one of the traits. So everybody gets the same information, but some people get warm and some people get cold. After that, the guest lecturer appeared, gave a lecture, and the students had an opportunity to chat with the lecturer for a period of 15 minutes before being asked to rate the person on 15 traits. Now, this is a real person. You had rich information, you had personal interaction, you got to meet the person and get to know them. Would warm and cold in the prior description still have an effect? Kelly found that there was a significant effect. People formed far more favorable impressions of the guest lecturer on all characteristics when he was described as warm rather than cold. Furthermore, the warm-cold manipulation also had a behavioral consequence. 56% of the students would have liked to stay for a discussion with the lecturer, but only 32% of them did so in the cold condition. This study is also a very nice illustration of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have an expectation of somebody being cold, then despite meeting that person, you will selectively look for and find evidence that confirms your expectation. It's a confirmatory bias, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. In the other condition, when you expect the person to be warm, you will selectively look for and find information that confirms the warm expectation. So person perceptions are hugely influenced by such biases, expectations, which can result to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you for your attention, and we are going to continue with the topic of social perception and cognition in the next lecture.